Get ready to be wowed by the amazing brilliance of Matt Segall, who is a prodigy. He is a philosophical wizard who is not even 30 years old. I am terrified to think of his accomplishments yet to come. Theo, who's from the future, knows better than I do. Actually, you should be introducing him because you know all about the encyclopedia that he's going to edit. You know about the system of speculative metaphysics that is yet to come, and the whole new political theory. And we're going to get a taste of that right now under the title Emerson and Whitehead Towards a Transcendentalist Cosmopolitics. Wow, that sounds pretty deep. Everyone, please join me in welcoming the priceless Matt Segall.
I have one, yeah. Can you guys hear me? Loud enough?
I'll keep this here in case you...
Thanks very much for that, Aaron. I'm going to talk about Emerson and Whitehead, not because I think they're identical thinkers, but because I think that there's some conflicts between their two centers of gravity, and I'm going to kind of try to construct, instead of a particle accelerator, a philosopher's accelerator, to collide them at high speed and see what fireworks are given off, and try to grab some of those fireworks and share them. Because really, I think there's a tension between at least the emphases that these two thinkers have in their thought. You know, Aaron was joking that I might develop a systematic metaphysical scheme or something, but I'm not quite sure if I think system is where it's at anymore, which is one of the tensions that I'm exploring here between Whitehead, a very systematic metaphysician, and Emerson, someone who's more of an essayist, more about discovering eloquent ways of conveying, bits and pieces of ancient wisdom. Whereas in the same essay, he'll often contradict himself several times. So he wasn't so much looking for systematic consistency, whereas Whitehead certainly was, though Whitehead wanted an open-ended system too that you could tinker with and hack, So the title, Towards a Transcendentalist Cosmopolitics, what I'm going to do is lead you through a sort of explication of each of these terms, transcendentalist and then cosmopolitics. So what is transcendentalism? Emerson is a transcendentalist, part of a transcendentalist movement in sort of the northeastern United States during the early to mid 1800s, and his transcendentalism was sort of received from, of course, the first one to use that term, Immanuel Kant, in Germany, right about 1781, when he published the Critique of Pure Reason. And I want to make a few distinctions between Kant's transcendentalism and what it became in America as it passed through the filter of Coleridge in England, and then across the Atlantic to America. For Kant, of course, he was trying to really limit human knowledge, and there was a sort of, a dualism at the heart of his approach to philosophy, where nature could only be an appearance for us that was kind of projected by the mind, or at least the mind can only know nature according to its own categories and its own forms of intuition. What nature was in itself, Kant wasn't willing to say. He said he had to limit our knowledge of nature in order to make room for faith, by which he meant to make room for freedom, immortality, these sort of guiding principles that give human life its special meaning. So in order, in Kant's day, dealing with Newtonian science, he had to say that Newton's deterministic mechanistic science only applied to appearances, to the way the mind experiences nature, not to nature itself. We can't say what nature itself is. And that was his way, because he said we don't know what nature itself is, he kind of left room for freedom, the soul, things that if we took Newton seriously and accepted what he was saying as the truth about nature itself, freedom of the soul wouldn't really, where are they going to fit in, right? Unless you have a sort of Cartesian dualism, but again, that's what Kant is kind of working with. Now for Emerson, he wasn't willing to accept that dualism. He wasn't willing to make that compromise to preserve human freedom by denying knowledge of nature. He thought that we could have knowledge of nature, what it really was in itself, and that knowledge would confirm and affirm our own freedom. So, like some of the post-Kantian thinkers, Schelling, for example, who overcame, and Hegel, who overcame Kant's compromise, Emerson wanted to affirm both a faith in freedom and knowledge of nature. So I'll quote you an example here of how Emerson does this. It's really hard to give a talk or to write something on Emerson because you just want to quote him over and over and over again because he's so eloquent. I'll try not to do that too much, but here's one. This is from his essay Selfreliance. He says, "We first share the life by which things exist, and afterwards see them as appearances in nature, and forget that we have shared their cause." So we first share the life by which things exist, and afterwards see them as appearances in nature, and forget that we have shared their cause. So Kant kind of begins in that place of forgetfulness, where there's a mind reflecting on a nature that is separate from it. Whereas Emerson's trying to get us to remember the common root of both our mind, our reflection on nature, and nature's coming into appearance, nature's manifestation. Before nature appears to us and before we reflect on that appearance, there's a common sort of creative core that gives rise to both of us. And Emerson's trying to evoke an experience of that common root that Kant thought we couldn't experience. So Emerson goes on, "Here, this common cause is the fountain of action and of thought," so of practice and of theory. "Here are the lungs of that inspiration which giveth man wisdom." Sorry about the pronouns here. He was a man of his time. He goes on, "We lie in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity. Time and space are but physiological colors which the eye makes, but the soul is light. Where it is day. Where it was is night." So, whereas for Kant, in his Transcendentalism, nature was just sort of this passive appearance that was shaped by the activity of the mind, Emerson wants to say that no, nature is an immense intelligence. Nature is an active presence, that the mind comes to understand itself and know itself by the reflection given to it by nature. So that the laws of our mind are in fact the laws of physics. And the laws of physics are the laws of our mind when rightly apprehended. And I think if we're going to try to think towards a transcendentalist cosmopolitics, and I'll try to unpack that term next, we need to, one of the most important steps to take is to think of nature as not just a passive raw material to be shaped by the freedom of the human, but as itself active, creative, and we need to allow it to inform us so that we can discover ourselves. You know, Emerson says that to the extent that we lack knowledge of nature, we lack knowledge of ourselves. Right? So then, cosmopolitics. This is a term that I think it was first introduced. I mean, it's building on this notion of cosmopolitanism, but also distancing. The thinkers that developed the cosmopolitics, like Isabel Stengers, Bruno Latour, drawing on Alfred North Whitehead's work, they want to distinguish between cosmopolitics and cosmopolitan in the traditional sense that, for example, Kant would write about it, because cosmopolitanism tends to have this Eurocentric bias, takes colonialism for granted, and it wants a kind of universal humanity, but a universal humanity shaped by the understanding of what white European males think the human being should be. So it's, in the eyes of these later Whiteheadian thinkers working on this notion of cosmopolitics, we need a sort of not only post-colonial, but also a more ecologically sensitive cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitics, where instead of the political realm being reserved for human beings, as though that's our unique difference, that we can, because we have a free rational soul, we can organize ourselves into law-abiding political systems, whereas nature is just a deterministic mechanism. The cosmopolitical perspective is that actually the polis, the city, civilization is a cosmic manifestation, and if we're going to strive for a democracy, planetary democracy, that should include not just all human beings, but all of the other species of organisms that call this planet home. And this is an ideal that we're pretty far from realizing now. We don't even have democracy in the sense of humans yet. So, but I think in striving for this further inclusivity to include other beings, not just human beings, and not just other living beings either. Talking about living and so-called inanimate matter as well, because it's from the perspective of Whitehead, what we think of as just minerals, inanimate matter, has a kind of life. Maybe it's still a kind of it's proto. It hasn't fully blossomed yet, but it's potential life. Like, we came from minerals. The Earth was just a molten rock before life appeared, right? So life permeates through and through down to the most fundamental particles or events that compose the universe. So this is a challenge. This isn't something that we can realize tomorrow. This is something that if civilization has a future, it will be because we have taken on this challenge and really included the rest of the non-human cosmos in our own political thought and action. And I think that, the modern scientific cosmology is an ally. When rightly interpreted, it's an ally in this project. Obviously, evolutionary theory prevents us from making any sort of sharp dichotomy between the human animal and other animals, other life forms. But also the evolutionary cosmology, the universe story, shows us that the universe is a historical event through and through. Usually, nature is thought of as fixed according to eternal laws, and then the human being appears and has its history, its gradual rise to, more advanced forms of governance and more a container to express our freedom and whatnot. But what the cosmopolitical perspective is suggesting is that it's not just human beings that have history, it's not just human beings that make these sort of irreversible decisions that push the course of events in one direction rather than another. The whole universe is a series of these, contingent events that are irreversible and that lead to new forms of flourishing or to degradation. And, that risk of the need to make decision on what to realize in the future has been here way before human beings, right? There's nothing necessary about the way the universe unfolded from someone like Whitehead's perspective. There are certain lures that are helping us along the way, but we have to recognize, I think, the historical contingency, just like the human political sphere is full of contingencies and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Republicans could decide to shut down the government again in a couple months, and we're going to have to deal with that, right? We're in the middle of a climate change where our science can tell us that something's going wrong, but we don't exactly know how that will play out. The system is too complex. There are so many directions it could go. So part of cosmopolitics is historicizing nature and recognizing the contingency involved in this evolutionary process. And that society includes not just humans, but all other organisms, right? So not just landowning white males, not just all human beings, but a multitude of non-human living and non-living creatures as well. So I'm going to tease apart this term cosmopolitics a little bit more and ask two questions. First, what does cosmology have to teach politics, and what does politics have to teach cosmology? So first, what does cosmology have to teach politics? Just the other day, I was reading the New York Review of Books, and the famed cosmologist Steven Weinberg had an essay that was about it was called "What We Know and What We Don't Know," or something like that. And he was sort of giving the last 100 years of history of physics and the discovery of the expanding universe and the completion of the standard model of particle physics. And what he basically arrived at the end of his little essay was that the best theory we have going, at least as far as the mainline sort of materialist cosmologists are concerned, is this idea of the multiverse, that our Big Bang, what we can perceive in terms of the cosmic background radiation, is just one universe among a multitude of others, infinitely many other universes. And the only reason that the constants of our universe happen to be so finely tuned so as to make life and intelligent life possible is random chance, because we just happen to be in that one universe of an infinite multitude of other universes that led to life and intelligence. And this is the weak anthropic principle, it's called. So that the reason we're so astonished by the fact that these constants are so finely tuned is that we could only exist in a universe where the constants were exactly what they are. So from Weinberg's perspective, he has a sort of nihilist understanding of this, that it puts a certain limit on scientific knowledge, that we can't ever actually come up with a mathematical or physical reason why the constants should be what they are. They're just arbitrary, and we'll never know the reason why they happen to be what they are. There's no systematic perspective that could explain why the constants had to manifest this way, because from his perspective they didn't. It's just random. And he'll sort of have this humanist card that he'll pull out of his back pocket somehow and say, even though the universe is completely meaningless and random, we human beings appeared on the scene, and we have freedom and intelligence and love and art and culture, and we can, despite the fact that we don't have any reason why the universe should exist, we can, as human beings, as a human society, we can make our own meaning up and somehow, thrive that way. Whitehead certainly would disagree. Whitehead says in his book Modes of Thought, in every advancing civilization, the sense of sacredness arising from the inherent value and meaning of the universe has found vigorous expression. So in every advancing civilization, a sense of the meaning and value of the universe has found vigorous expression. But this sense tends to retire into a recessive factor in experience as each phase of civilization enters upon its decay. So what Weinberg is saying is, from Whitehead's perspective, evidence of the decay of our civilization. When human beings lose connection with the sacred ground of the universe, they no longer have a sense of orientation. They no longer have those deep structures of meaning that can inform political life, ethics, values. And so things become arbitrary, totally relativist, and it all becomes a power play. And to a large extent, I think we're in a situation like that. On the other hand, we're in a situation where power wins out, but from both Emerson and Whitehead's perspective, power is a very important concept for understanding how nature works. And the emergence of human civilization, though it's continuous with the evolution of the rest of the cosmos, is, from Whitehead's perspective, it's an attempt to civilize the universe. And what that means is to shift from a form of power based on coercion, which, when you're dealing with the physical world, exploding stellar nebulae and spiral galaxies whose gravitation is so intense it sucks up anything in the environment. You're dealing with a kind of power that's force. It's coercive. There's no real choice involved in this. Whereas in human civilization, we like to think that we're gradually replacing coercion and force by persuasion and love, so that there's more of a chance for the freedom and creativity inherent in the universe to manifest itself in a way that's as cooperative and loving as possible. The potential's always been there in the universe from the beginning, but there's a sort of spectrum of development here. As the universe gets more civilized, it gets less coercive and more about persuasion and love, right? But when we're trying to understand the universe as it has evolved up to this point, we see that, as Emerson puts it, he says, power is in nature the essential measure of right. Nature suffers nothing to remain in her kingdoms which cannot help herself. The genesis and maturation of a planet, its poise and orbit, the bended tree recovering itself from the strong wind, the vital resources of every animal and vegetable, are demonstrations of the self-sufficing and therefore self-relying soul. This is in his essay, it's actually in Politics. It sounds like it could be from Selfreliance. So Emerson also says that the power of love as the basis of a state, as a human polis, has never been tried. We live in a very low state of the world and pay unwilling tribute to governments founded on force. There is not among the most religious and instructed men of the most religious and civil nations a reliance on the moral sentiment, and a sufficient belief in the unity of things to persuade them that society can be maintained without artificial restraints, as well as the solar system can maintain itself, or that the private citizen might be reasonable and the good neighbor without the hint of a jail or of confiscation. So, a state organized around love has never been tried, Emerson says. I don't know if it's never been tried. I think it has been tried, but it's not easy. Because there's a lot of weight, the weight of tradition, and so many of the traditions of civilization have been founded on force and war. As soon as you had the first civilizations, the first cities, you had warfare as well, right? Because we want to protect those on the inside of the wall from those on the outside. 10?
No,
8. Okay.
Let's call it 7.
Let's call it 7. So this weight of the tradition of civilization that's founded on violence is preventing us from stepping into where we'd all really like to be, which would be a civilization founded on freedom and love. That's the goal, ultimately. And there are a lot of conservative forces that prevent that type of reform from happening. And I think both Whitehead and Emerson are on the side of, what we would call today progressivism. But they both respect tradition as well. So we need to find a kind of compromise here. And I think I can say this in about 4 minutes and then I'll stop for questions. This is a myth that Emerson conveys in his essay called The Conservative about Saturn and Uranus. And I think he wrote this in the 1840s, I think, and he already had a very clear understanding of the archetypal meaning of Uranus as it's understood today. So he says, the story goes that Saturn, Kronos, grew weary of sitting alone, or with none but the great Uranus or heaven beholding him, and so he created an oyster. Then he would act again, but he made nothing more, but instead went on creating the race of oysters. Finally, Uranus cried, "A new work, O Saturn! The old is not good again." Saturn replied, "I fear. There is not only the alternative of making and not making, but also of unmaking. Seest thou the great sea, how it ebbs and flows? So it is with me. My power ebbs, and if I put forth my hands, I shall not do, but undo. Therefore, I do what I have done. I hold what I have got, and so I resist night and chaos." "O Saturn," replied Uranus, "thou canst not hold thine own, but by making more. Thy oysters and barnacles and cockles, and with the next flowing of the tide there will be pebbles and sea foam." "I see," rejoined Saturn, "thou art in league with night. Thou art become an evil eye. Thou speakest from love. Now thy words smite me with hatred. I appeal to fate. Must there not be rest?" "I appeal to fate also," said Uranus. "Must there not be motion?" But Saturn was silent, and went on making oysters for 1,000 years. After that, the word of Uranus came into his mind like a ray of sun, and he made Jupiter. And then he feared again, and nature froze. The things that were made went backward, and so, to save the world, Jupiter slew his father Saturn. This may stand for the earliest account of a conversation between a conservative and a radical, which has come down to us. It is ever thus. So, I don't think Emerson's painting Saturn or the conservative in a totally negative light. He's saying that, creation is dangerous and risky. Trying to bring forth the novel always risks unraveling and dismantling the past. And we need to strike a balance between and be compassionate towards the traditions that have gotten us to this point, violent though they may be at times. There's a need to compromise between habit and novelty. Too much novelty too fast can be really frightening, disruptive, scary, chaotic. From Whitehead's perspective, novelty in the wrong season is evil, right? Novelty, creativity that doesn't respect the habits and the habitat upon which the ground upon which it stands is evil, because it disrupts what has been accomplished to this point. So Whitehead and Emerson, what I want to leave you with, and hopefully there's 3 or 4 minutes for questions, is that they call upon people like us, scholars, thinkers, to not only reflect on how we'd like the world to be, but to act in the world in such a way as to make that our ideas manifest in a very similar way to what Max was conveying to us earlier. But that part of the activity that we can manifest as scholars is actually thinking. To the extent that we can remain thinking people in this particular era in history, we can avoid falling prey to various ideologies, various totalitarian ideologies. And from Emerson's perspective, who was certainly one who wanted to elevate the individual, he would mark a difference between, to think we need to be in solitude, but being in solitude is not being lonely and retreating into private life. Being in solitude means being with yourself. And only when you're with yourself can you actually think. And thinking in solitude prevents us from falling prey to the social inertia that would lead us to just zone out, watch TV, and eat potato chips on the couch. That's a sign of loneliness. That's not a sign of the kind of solitude that would make the condition possible for real thought. So thinking is a kind of action, and we as scholars should keep that in mind. So thank you. That's it.
We have about 90 seconds for questions.
Hey, Eric.
The wonderful, first of all, it's brilliant, brilliantly thought through and organized and presented in such a short time. The point you were making on Weinberg, we had the summary of the New York Review of Books article, and that the multiverse is the best theory we have for explaining the anthropic reality that we find ourselves in, that would otherwise seem to suggest that we, for a purpose, that the universe is pregnant with life and humanity. We had this conference called the Cosmological Imagination at UCC about 10 years ago, and at it, in Brian's talk, we discussed at the very end this exact issue, and we were reflecting on how science, which is so committed to generally Occam's razor, of the minimum number of entities to explain a phenomenon. And in this case, it's willing to completely violate it in the most unlimited way in order to preserve this absolute assumption that there could be no purpose in the universe. It's a very interesting characterological distortion that permeates the whole.
It's like who's projecting at this point, right? Like,
exactly.
There's anthropomorphism, but then there's mechanomorphism.
Exactly. Which is another form of anthropocentrism, because it's saying only human beings have the capacity for purpose.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that the same as the spiritual logic of Capitalism?
Well, in some ways, I think that in order for, I agree with Theo, or with Max, and probably Theo too, that capitalism isn't all bad. We need markets, and money isn't intrinsically evil. But in order for the sort of situation to continue as it is on the planet today, where capitalism dominates all other spheres of life, we need to have a reductionistic understanding of nature. Otherwise, we wouldn't be so willing to reshape it to our own desires. We wouldn't be so willing to say that there is no value inherent to the universe and to the earth until human beings take it out of the state of nature as raw material and shape it into something to be sold in the marketplace. We would, if we recognized all the other species of life on this planet as intrinsically valuable, that would really put a check on the kind of commodification of everything that is running the world today. So I think, bringing forth a new cosmology and a new vision of the root of value in the universe would be the most effective way to resist that total commodification of nature and of the human, because it's starting to encroach on the sacred territory of the human soul now too. Probably it. Thanks, guys.